The prophecy has been fulfilled. All right, I need your help. Calling all young Heretics listeners, bat signal going out across the lands. Somebody needs to tell me where that line, the prophecy has been fulfilled, comes from. Because obviously there's a million different movies and books and epic poems in which prophecies get fulfilled. It's a major theme of all of literature. We're going to talk today about a bunch of prophecies getting fulfilled in the Aeneid. That's why the line was in my head the whole time I was preparing for this episode, and I kept thinking, like, this is a meme. This is a thing that I see all over the internet. Elon Musk tweeted it one time. People attach it to all sorts of silly news stories. I've seen it like associated with Cartoon Network shows like Teen Titan and a bunch of different things. But then when I put my internet sleuth hat on and I went to like knowyourmeme.com doing very serious academic research, and I tried to figure out where is the original source of this line? Where is there a movie or a book or a text where somebody says that specifically in that kind of tone, not ironically as a quotation and not in a meme, but as an actual statement about a prophecy that is getting fulfilled? And for the life of me, I could not find one. I feel like this is like a meme without a source. Like it's just a vibe or an attitude or a thing that happens a lot in our experience. And so we say it all the time as a catchphrase, but I can't find anywhere where it actually occurs in a text. Again, lots of prophecies get fulfilled in the Bible, in epic literature, in the Aeneid specifically. We're going to talk about that today. But where does this actual meme come from? Because maybe I'm just getting old and I don't know how to use the internet anymore or something, but I can't find the original source of that line. More to the point, more importantly, today is our day to talk about the fulfillment of prophecies in the Aeneid and the fulfillment of prophecies in epic literature, in literature more generally. This is a major, major theme. It still is in some ways, in even modern literature, when we talk about foreshadowing or dreams that come true in the future, etc. But in a more God-enchanted world, a world with more sense of the divine, or what we might call the numinous, that is the sacred kind of plan permeating the universe, prophecies were even more important, even more upfront, and they were part of a narrative structure because the narrative itself was a kind of prophecy. A lot of the time when you're dealing with a story like the stories in the Aeneid, which existed already before Virgil took them up, prophecies and predictions and knowledge about the future is an incredibly powerful tool in a poet's arsenal to introduce these ideas that we know things are going to happen. Maybe the characters do, maybe they don't. There's some dramatic irony like we talked about last week. And today I want to talk about as Aeneas is arriving in what will become Rome, what is now Latium, as he's getting there and finally reaching the ultimate destination of the Odyssey part of his journey, there are going to be a bunch of prophecies getting fulfilled and coming true. And Virgil is doing, I did not even realize this before I set out the full extent to which Virgil is doing some incredibly cool things with prophecies, especially in book 7, this first book of the next section. But in general, we're talking about this second half of the poem and the final victory, really, ultimately, the success, at least, of this expedition, which has been fated. That has been the major point of the whole thing, is there's fate hanging over Aeneas. He knows where he has to go. He knows where he's going to go. And the question of his own free will is very much an open one, as it is generally in epic. To what extent can he choose to fight against his destiny? But whether or not he can, his job is not to, right? The values of this poem are all in the direction of Rome and of piety, which means obligation and duty to what the gods want of you, to what your civilization needs of you at this pivotal moment. And the first half of the poem was kind of about Aeneas becoming the kind of guy in an Odyssean type journey, becoming the kind of guy who can fulfill these prophecies. And now it's going to become about him fulfilling those prophecies. But obviously, as I say, prophecy is itself this profound idea throughout literature. It's not one that Virgil invented. And Virgil is writing what's sometimes called a secondary epic, which means he's already entering into a tradition. He's writing his epic down. He's not singing it live in real time or inventing it as he goes. And that means he gets to comment and he gets to play and even maybe subvert some of these traditions. And that's part of the epic genre from here on out. I mean, Virgil is a master of this craft, and he inspires Dante and a lot of other subsequent epic poets in this way, that he doesn't just take the tradition and reproduce it and use it as this kind of dead letter. He revives it and he works with it and he engages with it and he pours the reality of his moment into the vessel of the tradition. And nowhere is that more true than in what I think is one of the coolest moments in the poem. I'm so excited about this. I had never noticed this before until I started to think about what do we want to talk about for this next episode and how do we want to get into kind of the meat of this action. And there is a particular prophecy that's very, very famous. This is not something that I just noticed just now. This is something that everyone knows all about. And that is, there's a big moment in the poem when Aeneas arrives on shore, which is that his crew set out a meal, and then they're so hungry that they even eat the kind of flatbread cakes that the meal is on top of. And their provisions are getting low, right? They've been on this long journey and this is all they have. So they even eat the flatbread cakes. And Iulus, who is Aeneas' son, notices that this is happening and says, "Holy crow, what's going on, man? We're even eating our tables." And this is a huge moment because it seems like a trivial if you just talk about it that way, but young Heretics listeners will remember, extra credit if you've been around from the beginning, that this is the fulfillment of a prophecy. There was a prophecy about eating tables, that once they were hungry enough to eat their tables, then they would have finally arrived at the place and all their wanderings would be at an end. So that's what Aeneas notices when Iulus or Ascanius makes this joke. As usual, I have translated the passage in which this happens, and I'm going to read my translation in Alexandrians for you. It begins with an amazing Latin word that we used to love in high school when I was first learning to translate this poem, heus, which literally means hey. It's basically a precursor of our word hey, and it's just an exclamation, and that's what Iulus says. "Hey," said Iulus, "we're even eating our tables now." That's all a joke. But in that speech, there could be heard the first beginnings of their labor's end. You can hear, and this is in the Latin, this whole passage is going to be about primus, primus, prima, prima, first, first, first. This is a first moment where their labors come to an end. So it's the beginning of the end of their labors. The first beginnings of their labors end. At once, his father seized on it in awe of the divine and cut him off, that is, cut his son off. And this is what Aeneas said: "Hail, promised land of destiny. And hail," he said, "O faithful Trojan gods of home," the Penates that he's been bringing with him since Troy fell, right? Faithful Trojan gods of home. "This is my home, my fatherland, my patria." Big statement, totally new place he's never been to before. Suddenly, this is the land of his fathers, of his ancestors. So there's something very weird going on here where he's grafting his own local, personal past onto this totally new place. We're going to get into talking about that. "This is my home, my fatherland. My father said as much, and I retell it now. Anchises left these secret utterings of fate behind with me, the arcana, fatorum reliquit. He left these secret utterings of fate behind with me." And this is what Aeneas says that Anchises, his father, said: "Upon that shore where hunger like you've never known will force you to devour your tables with your meal, my weary son, then hope for home. Remember then to touch the land first thing and set your hands to build." End quote. That's what Aeneas says Anchises prophesied about eating the tables, that then they would be at their home and they could start building a new civilization. "This was that hunger," says Aeneas. "This will put an end for good to all our wanderings." That's another short, unfinished line there. "So come and with the dawning of the day enjoy, track down to start with what these regions are and where the border walls and habitations are." This is a standard, typical way of talking in epic, that when you arrive in a new place, you go, look, what kinds of people are there? This is sort of from the Odyssey, but there's versions of it throughout epic. Track down to start with what these regions are and where the border walls and habitations are and whose. And let's set out from port in all directions too. Now pour paternal prayers and offerings to Jove and to Anchises. Fill the wine cups up again. So lots going on in this passage. For one thing, there's a kind of appropriation going on here. And we're going to get into this more next time when we talk more about the history of the Latins and Latinus. But there's a sort of semi-awkward thing going on where this is the destined home of the Trojans who are arriving. However, it has what you might call an indigenous population, a Latinx population, if you like. That is, the Latins are here already, and they have their own long history and prophecies, as we are going to discover in just a bit. They also have prophecies from their local reality and from what they've experienced over generations in this place. And now Aeneas is coming, and he has a definite prophecy from God, a manifest destiny, if you like, that this is going to be his home. And so he suddenly, immediately, takes his whole history, the history of Troy, which is a totally different place from very far away in the east, takes all that history and says that history is here now. That history belongs to this land. And the history of Troy instantly becomes the history of Latium, of Italy. And then the two are going to kind of fuse into Rome, and they're going to acquire like a past all of a sudden out of nothing. And the prophecy is kind of how they're going to do that, how that's going to work. But there's something even more fascinating. And this is the thing that really blew my mind when I first noticed it. There's something even more interesting going on here, which is that Aeneas is telling us that his father, Anchises, was the one who made this prophecy about eating the bread, right? That is the tables. And now that prophecy has been fulfilled. Hooray! What a happy fulfillment of a happy prophecy about our happy home. Except there's only one problem, which is that so far as we can tell from the poem, that is from the Aeneid, Aeneas is completely wrong about that. It was not Anchises, and we were there. We were the young Heretics audience and crew. We were there in book 3 when this prophecy was delivered, and it was most definitively not Anchises who made the prophecy. In fact, it was as far from being Anchises as it is possible to be. Anchises even prayed that this prophecy would not come to pass because the person who actually made it, or I should say the being who actually made it, was the harpy Colino. So you might recall the harpies are these hideous, grotesque, kind of demon women birds from myth. They already existed when Virgil set out to write this. They're in Hesiod. They're in Aeschylus. They're monsters, and they feed on food. They're gross. They kind of contaminate everything. They're scavenger, vulture types, and they have tormented various characters in mythology, in particular King Phineus, and they wouldn't let him eat. And then now they've ended up, Colino, the eldest of the harpies, and a variety of other harpies have ended up on the Strophades, which is a group of islands, and remember that name, Strophades, that's become important. They've ended up on the Strophades, and they are doing the same thing to Aeneas and his men. Aeneas and his men are trying to eat, they're trying to have a meal, and the harpies keep swooping in and nomming their noms. They keep coming in and basically like ripping apart the beasts and the flesh that they want to eat and making it gross and disgusting. And so there's a skirmish. They have a kind of run-in with the harpies. It's a bit of a stalemate, except that Colino, when she is rebuffed by Aeneas' men, issues this hideous, awful prophecy that makes everyone very unhappy. And she says this. This is from book 3, and way back when I translated this. So this is the original prophecy when we actually get it in the poem itself. Listen to this. War for some slaughtered cows? Some disemboweled calves? Sons of Laomedon, are you prepared to go to war to drive the blameless harpies from their realm? Take in my words, then. Let them fester in your souls. From Zeus the Father, the Omnipotent, to Phoebus, Apollo Phoebus passed them on to me, and I, the eldest of the Furies, lay them bare to you. The object of your quest is Italy. So they're on their way, they're trying, but they're still in the midst, they're really in the thick of it as they're journeying along. The object of your quest is Italy. The winds you call will come, and you will be allowed to enter Italy, but not to wrap your walls around the city that's been granted, not until a bitter hunger and the guilt of our destruction forces you to gnaw and eat your tabletops. That's the prophecy as we heard it. And what then immediately happens is that Anchises makes a prayer that prophecy will not come to pass, that this kind of suffering Colino is wishing upon them will be averted. And so this is a very dark and grim version of kind of the same themes that are now getting whitewashed over in this positive way, right? She says, look, you're going to go to war to claim what is ours. This is our home. The Strophides, these islands, are our home. You're coming to take what's ours. And are you going to go to war for that? Hint, hint. Are you going to go to war over Latium, right? This indigenous place, this population that already has a history? Well, fine, then I curse you. I curse you with this prophecy, this future, which I say that I get from Zeus on high, that in fact you won't get there until you're so hungry that you eat your tables. So what is going on here? Why is that very dark moment suddenly being repurposed and really reimagined, reinvented as a totally positive blessing that came from Anchises? Well, the key, I think, is in another speech, a very famous speech that we actually haven't talked about yet, even though it's in book one. And I was kind of saving it for the right moment, but I didn't know that this is the moment when we need to talk about a very, very famous speech from book one, right after Aeneas washes up on the shores of Carthage. So if you think back to that beginning, right, the poem begins in medias res. It launches into the middle of things. And the place where we meet Aeneas is kind of at his low point. There's a storm sent by Juno, and he ends up in Carthage, which is going to be the site of his disastrous love affair with Dido. But first, he does something very similar to what he does in Latium, which is he wanders around, tries to find out what's going on, and he comes back to his men, and he makes this speech, a beautiful speech, encouraging them essentially to buck up, even though things look extremely grim. And this is how the speech goes. Okay, so now we're back in book one. We've gone from book 7 to book 3 to book 1. He says, companions, oh, Sokii, companions, we're no strangers to catastrophe. You veterans of suffering, there is a God who will yet bring an end to what we suffer now. You weathered Scylla's frenzy and the thundering within her cliffs, the boulders of the Cyclops too. In this you are well versed. Restore your spirits now. Dismiss this miserable fear. A time may come when you recall this very day with satisfaction. That's the famous line. Forsan et haec olim meminisse iuvabit. When I was in college, one of the dining halls had a stained glass mirror that said, Forsan et haec olim meminisse iuvabit, meaning, I guess, kind of tongue-in-cheek, that if you're struggling with your homework and if you're grinding through and you're griping and you feel bad about all the work you have to do in college, one day you might even look back on this and be nostalgic. And that is very, very true. And it's something that we've all experienced, which is probably why this line is so famous, that when you're in the middle of something really painful and difficult, and when you're doing a grand endeavor like getting a college degree, the effort involved can be extremely strenuous, the setbacks can be painful, and the actual work, the labor, is not fun in the moment. And yet, at the end, if it all works out, you get your degree, you look back, and suddenly there's rose-tinted glasses, right? Suddenly you remember, in my case, we had the anthem of our college, bright college years with pleasure rife, right? Suddenly this time that felt full of anxiety, maybe relationship struggles, definitely lots of hard work and confusion and all this stuff, suddenly it feels like the best days of your life, which, by the way, I've never felt like that's true of college. In fact, it's a real bad sign if college is the best days of your life. But that idea is there, right? That when we look back on this difficult time, this painful moment, we will smile to know about it, right? And this is the ultimate expression of that, because the thing that Aeneas and his crew are doing is not getting a bachelor's degree. They are within an inch of their lives, right? They're grinding through the thick of this Odyssey and journey. They don't really know how they're supposed to accomplish all that they've set out, all that has been set out for them, and they've lost an enormous amount. And so Aeneas is basically giving this, I think, extremely motivational speech where he says, one day, we happy few will look back on this and we will smile even to remember. It will please us even to remember these sorrows. And so, he goes on, through every manner of disaster, on through every changing circumstance, press on to Latium, where fate holds out a resting place for us. It's there the realms of Troy can rise again. Endure and steel yourselves, for better days to come. Now, this is obviously a classic, famous speech. The sentiment in it is an extremely classic one, universal. This idea that one day we're going to look back on this and smile, right? There's a psalm, those that sow in tears shall reap in joy, kind of the same idea. And I already sort of alluded to the St. Crispin's Day speech in Shakespeare's Henry V, right? If anyone wishes that there were more of us here in this hard-fought battle, then shut your mouth, because we happy few, we band of brothers, we're lucky to be here facing these high odds. And those who are now at home in bed will count their manhoods cheap, right? They won't sleep well on St. Crispin's Day because we went through the fight and we went through the ringer. And Aeneas is kind of saying that, right? He's giving this motivational speech, but Virgil tells us he doesn't really feel that way. And so he's having to project himself into the future when in his heart, he's only experiencing the bitter pain of the present. That the narrator then tells us, Aeneas says, endure and steel yourself for better days to come. Then the narrator says, or so he said, talia voce refert. Within his heart was sick with grief. He feigned a hopeful face and pushed the pain deep down. So he's got this pain in his heart, but this hope in his voice, right? And that contrast is also part of the picture that Virgil is giving us at the beginning of the poem, that this is a guy who basically has to live as if the prophecy were already fulfilled while feeling that it's not at all. He has to feel the feelings of the present while projecting the leadership of the future. He has to live into the prophecy even when he doesn't feel like it. And we all have had that experience. It's incredibly relatable, which is one of the core experiences, I think, especially of manly leadership, right? That you sometimes have to fake it till you make it, but also just of anyone that's gone through a difficult experience. Sometimes you have to live into the way you'll feel when it's all done. When you're really grinding, say, at a hard workout, just to give a very basic example, or if you're working at a degree that's really difficult, or you're struggling through your PhD thesis, or, you are a soldier in basic training and you're in so much pain and everything about your current moment is screaming out, this sucks. That's when you live in prophecy, right? That's when you think, but it's going to be awesome when I'm done, right? When I did my black belt test, that thought of how it's going to feel when it's done is the only thing keeping you going, right? Like Rudyard Kipling in his poem If says, you have to hold on when there is nothing in you except the will that says to your legs, hold on, right? That says, keep pumping, push your legs and run one extra mile. That's kind of what Aeneas is doing here. And he's doing it through prophecy. He's doing it by imagining himself and his crew into the future and saying, one day we're going to look back on this and we're going to smile. So what are we going to look back on and smile? That's the question, right? Well, what has just happened when Aeneas makes this speech is the whole run-in with the Harpies and Celaeno in Book 3. This is really easy to miss because everything happens out of order in many epics, especially this one, right? We enter into this moment very purposefully into this lowest point, and we get this speech very early on to kind of frame the whole poem, that this low point, this destruction and disaster is going to somehow be redeemed in retrospect, right? That's the story, that's kind of the theme of the story. But what has just happened prior, chronologically in the story, is the Celaeno prophecy that you will be ravenous to the point of eating your tables when you arrive, finally, that you have so much more suffering yet ahead of you. And the other thing that has happened in Book 3, at the end of Book 3, is that Anchises has died. Aeneas' father has died. And I talked a lot about what a blow that must have been to Aeneas and how he has to basically step into that role of father of the family before he's ready, and he loses his father, and this is a totally rudderless moment for him. And so those are the things, the haec, when he says, it's going to be good to remember even this, those are the things he's talking about. He's talking about Celaeno and the evil curse and the death of Anchises. And so fast forward now, right, to Book 7, when he's looking back and they are now eating their tables, this is the fulfillment of that prophecy too. It's not just the fulfillment of the Celaeno prophecy that tells them they've arrived at their destination. It's also the fulfillment of the moment when Aeneas says, one day we're going to look back with pleasure, even on this pain. They're doing it when Iulus says, "Hey, look, we're eating our tables," and it's a joke rather than a curse. When I figured this out and put this chronology together, it was like galaxy brain, blew my mind, because it's sort of, you take the felt board and you put the pins all together, and you're thinking, like, is Virgil just making a mistake? Like, is this another unfinished part of the poem? And it's possible, right, that Virgil just didn't get to polish this part as much as he would have liked. There is an unfinished line kind of in the vicinity, so that's one cue that maybe he meant to say that Kalino said the prophecy, but actually that Anchises said the prophecy. But if you put all of this together and you think about, like, what's going on and what is now happening, the promise that Virgil is delivering on, that we got at the beginning with this idea that we were going to look back in happiness on things that are painful, I actually think that Virgil's doing something incredibly sneaky and incredibly subtle here, which is that he's showing us the fulfillment of Kalino's prophecy. He's showing us the fulfillment of Aeneas' prediction that one day they would look back on Kalino's prophecy and smile. But he's showing that happening, and in the process, Aeneas isn't just remembering, he's misremembering, or maybe even rewriting history, retelling it in a different way. And he says, when he's talking about it in Book 7, he says, nunc repeto, which is like, now I go back over it, or even I retell this story in a different way in light of having arrived, in light of the joy and the retrospect and the hindsight. And it's there that he basically writes Kalino out of the picture and puts his dead father, whom he's now met and gotten blessed by in the underworld, puts his dead father in the place of this evil harpy and says, it was my father who told me that this is how the prophecy was going to be fulfilled. Now, does this mean that Aeneas is lying? It's possible, just like it's possible that Virgil is simply making a mistake here about the way that this prophecy works, and if he had had time, he would have kind of smoothed out, ironed all of this out. I don't think so. We don't actually know. Part of the genius of a great work of art is that there's what we get told, and then there is the whole world that is created outside of the world of the poem, which doesn't, like, really exist, right? That there's no story except the one that Virgil is telling. But part of the story is everything that supposedly happens, quote unquote, backstage. So it is possible for us to imagine that after Kalino's prophecy, there was some sort of, like, private conversation between Anchises and Aeneas, where the father told the son, don't worry, I know from the gods that this bitter prophecy will actually be fulfilled in this happy way, or something like that, something that we weren't privy to, that we can now imagine. And maybe now Aeneas is remembering that, and he's sort of emphasizing that part, and he's calling that to mind. At the time, he didn't think much of it, but now he sees, oh, the arcana fatorum that my father had, those are now coming to pass, right? That's one way of understanding what's going on here. Another way of understanding what's going on here is that Aeneas is simply rewriting history, either purposefully or unintentionally, right? He's just looking back and remembering this in the bliss and the joy and the thrill and excitement of arriving finally in Latium. He's basically fudging the details. He's like, oh, now I'm looking back. And this also totally happens. Sometimes you talk to mothers who have had a painful childbirth experience, and they'll say, yeah, I remember that it was very painful, but the feeling of the pain, the actual suffering, was transformed when I held my happy baby in my hand. And in some ways, the actual experience, the actual memory changed because of its outcome, because of this beautiful thing that came out of it. And in some ways, I sort of think that's what's happening here. It's a theme that we've come back to in Young Heretics, not with the Aeneid specifically, but in general. There's a wonderful passage in C.S. Lewis's Perelandra, which is the second book in his space trilogy, where he talks about, the main character is speaking with a dear friend, and the friend says, look, when we met one another, this was just the kind of seed of our meeting, right? The seed of our friendship was made when we shook hands or whatever, when we first encountered each other. But we weren't fully experiencing all the meaning of that moment until much later on, right? When I am on my deathbed and I look back on that meeting, then it will have its full character. And there is a way in which the truth of our experience isn't just in the details of the things that are happening right now. It's also in the revelation that comes as we look back and as we understand in retrospect. And this, I think, is the true power of prophecy and the reason why it's such a potent thing in literature. Because if you notice in the prophecies of the Bible, which are probably the prophecies we're most familiar with, one of the things that happens again and again throughout the Bible, especially in the New Testament, so for Christians, is that you look back on prophecies from totally different eras, and they have a whole new meaning once you've realized that Jesus has been resurrected, right? This happens on the road to Emmaus. It happens all the time in St. Paul, right? Paul is always looking back and saying, like, when Isaiah was talking about the sun bursting over Zion, or when he was talking about the shoot coming from Jesse, right? That was actually about this savior that came in David's line. And sometimes the interpretation is not obvious at all, except when you've already experienced and been through the thing. So prophecies take on their full meaning, even if you're not a Christian, this is true. Prophecies take on their full meaning in retrospect because life takes on its full meaning in retrospect. We can't actually predict the future, but we can see the design in history when we look back. And that is a big part of why prophecy is so important to storytelling, because storytelling is our way of infusing our memory with that meaning and structure. It's not lying exactly. It's not untelling the truth or telling falsehoods. It's telling a fuller truth than, at least when we do it well, right? And we don't, sometimes people do just lie, right? Sometimes people just tell the wrong story or they make a mistake. And it is, again, always possible that that's what Virgil's doing here. But also, it's possible that what's happening is he's giving us a picture of what it looks like to realize the full truth of an experience in retrospect. That in some ways, actually, the black belt that you get at the end of the grueling test is the truest reality, the fullest reality, because it is the blossoming of the flower, right? And the suffering that you're experiencing now is only one part of the experience. It's only partial. It's not complete yet. And when you're grinding through the hard workout, right, the pain is only one part of the experience, but the fullness of anything, right, is in its fruition. The fullness of the flower is not in the seed, but in what the seed grows into be. And that's what's happening here. That's also, I think, what is happening when Paul says things like, our present situation is nothing. Our present sufferings are nothing compared to the glory that is to come, right? That the reality of the thing is in its outcome. And even the past takes on that character in retrospect, right? That even the past has its full meaning once we know what its outcome ultimately is. And again, this is also the meaning of the saying, by your fruits you shall know them, right? Things can feel really good in the present that are actually awful, and you only see how awful they were in your regret afterward, right? Feels really great to get trashed, to get drunk, right? Feels really great to like sleep with a stranger physically in the moment. But there's that voice in your head that says, I know I'm going to regret this. And the trick is, the devil's trick, this is the inverse of the good version of this, right? The devil's trick is that when you wake up and you regret, that regret sours even the pleasure in retrospect. This is why C.S. Lewis in the Screwtape Letters says that heaven and hell are both retrospective, that even the things we do that feel good, that we know are wrong and evil, will feel bad when we remember them and we condemn them in the light of our sorrow and our suffering. And in much the same way, even the suffering and the self-sacrifice and the difficulty that we put into valuable things, right? Getting a black belt test, doing justice in the world, right? Getting a college degree, founding Rome, right? Even the suffering that we have in that experience is going to look like pleasure, is going to bring pleasure in the memory, in the retelling. And that is what is happening here, and why I think there is a discrepancy between the retelling when it is pleasurable to remember these things and the moment when it happens in book 3 with Kalino and the bleak and the grim and the darkness, right? This is, I think, profound in and of itself, but there's even an extra galaxy brain layer to it, because why is this idea of prophecy in retrospect so important for Virgil? Well, it's what he's doing with the Aeneid, right? The Aeneid is, in some sense, the fulfillment of a prophecy, and it's a reinterpretation of Rome's history. It's this story that is about the past, that takes place in the past, that contains all these prophecies of the future that are actually the recent past for Virgil and his audience, right? So Virgil and his audience are looking back from the perspective of someone looking forward, and they are retelling the history of Rome so that it culminates in the Augustan Empire. And this is something that Augustus himself was a master of. We've talked a little bit about how he deleted certain Sibylline prophecies, how he threw certain Sibylline books into the fire, how he curated the records of Rome. And some of this was actual necessary housekeeping because there were erroneous things that had crept their way into the record, and there was all sorts of bad stuff that needed to be culled that was false in the histories. But of course, if it's Augustus who's in charge, who's in control of this, and if he's unilaterally doing it, he also gets to tell the story exactly how he wants it told so that his reign is the destined thing. And the only person that can talk about that can see that for the fullness of what it is the artist who stands just outside of it. Because Virgil is participating in that myth making, right? We've talked about this before, he is honoring Augustus with this story of his distant mythical ancestor Aeneas and how he triumphed and how he founded Rome, etc., etc. And yet he is also, for those with ears to hear, right, he is building in an awareness that there is some myth-making that goes into that. There is some retelling. Nunc repeto, now I retell it. And the real Easter egg is that if you go back and you look at the name, the Strophades, the island where the Harpies live, where this all begins and take place, where kind of the issue that's under dispute, the name Strophades means the turning point. It's a Greek name, and it means the place where things turn around, right? And so that's what is happening. It was the turning point in Aeneas' journey. It is the turning point in retrospect that they didn't even see was going on. And it is the fulcrum around which this grand statement that Virgil is making, this very complicated grand design from book 1 all the way up to book 7 and on into this next section, it's the fulcrum around which it all turns. I think this is one of Virgil's masterstrokes. This is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen Virgil do. And like I say, I just kind of figured out that this, I think, is what he's doing. But it's key to his whole story and what he understands himself to be doing too, that this is now going to be the redemption of all the suffering that has gone before and everything that has been lost in the past. But it's only the beginning of the end. And that was in that passage that I just read a bunch of times, right? The prima, this is first, the beginning of the end of all our sufferings, is what's going on in the passage where Aeneas says, like, oh, this is where we're supposed to be. But it's only the beginning because now we have this whole new war coming up. And this was also part of Kalino's curse, that you are going to have to fight for something that is already owned by somebody else. And now we come to a passage or a section that is really immediately current, like ripped from the headlines for today, because Virgil really is dealing with a set of questions that we are very vexed over in the modern day, which is what happens when a new foreign population, that is, say, the Portuguese from their exploring ships, right, come to a place that is already settled, like Japan. They arrive in Japan. What happens when Christopher Columbus makes it to America? What happens when there is this manifest destiny that these, British colonists have decreed that they have to start a totally new story in this place? How should the locals react? And in the modern day, in the trendy, fashionable narrative, there's only one answer to that question, right? And that is they should be outraged and indignant. And there are characters we're going to meet who are outraged and indignant that Aeneas is coming in with this whole apparatus of supposed divine ordained claim ownership to this land. And they're going to say, wait a minute, we already have our own divine claim to this land. We have an ancient history too. And this is a stand-in for something that was real about Rome in its distant past. The Latins and their associated peoples are very much stand-ins for the Etruscans and the other kind of socii, which is a word I used earlier, meaning companions, the other allies in the kind of Latin League, were people that surrounded the Romans. And the Romans were, or they understood themselves to have been, kind of this ragtag invader crew. They were ex-cons and criminals, and this is all later than the history of, or the myth and the legend of Aeneas. But this is part of the Romans' identity as well, that they were late arrivals in an already existing civilization. And they had to find some way to integrate, to conquer, to what? And the view of that was very, very contested. So one way of saying that is these guys are colonizers, right? They are evil just thieves. And that view is kind of there in the Kilino prophecy, and it's there in some of the people that are going to meet now with the Trojans, that we'll get to. But it's not the only possible view. There is also, and this is the view I think that Aeneas himself brings as kind of a good conqueror, or a good king, a good kind of, what's the word? A good explorer and a good arrival, is that there is the possibility here for a noble fusion of two histories. Because there are also prophecies that are about the Latins. And one of the things that Virgil does is he conjures this whole ancient history into the land of Rome long before Rome was ever founded, and kind of like the sun and the moon and the earth like aligning, coming into alignment for an eclipse. These prophecies are coming into intersection with one another, and there's a fusion of the Trojan history, the Trojan past, and the Latin history that is possible here, that can take place, so that the locals can be part of the grand new destiny that is indisputably arriving here. I think, and I'm going to talk more about this next time because this is a really big subject, but I think that this is something we could say about, for example, the founding of America. Not that this was evil white colonizers coming to slaughter and take and kill and only rape and pillage and murder. There was plenty of misbehavior and wrongdoing and evil in the process. There always is in human history. That's a given. But also, we could look back on this past and say, there really was something grand and glorious about America. America is a country with a unique history, a unique constitution that ushered in an age of liberty on this continent, and an incredibly sophisticated innovation in political theory and history. And so this was what was happening in history. There was no version of events in which the Native Americans were going to simply persist in the way of life that they were living, because Europe was bursting its seams and becoming industrialized. And that was happening all over the world. And history was rolling into a new era. And it is possible to think of that story as sweeping up the Native Americans too. And there are Native Americans who became American citizens, right? And who were swept up into this grand history, as well as those who resisted and thought of this as an evil invasion. And so it's possible to look at this both ways, but it might be that one way is more productive. Like, even if both ways are sort of like, if there's truth to both points of view, and if there's truth to like the resentment that the natives must have felt when the Europeans came over, and there's also truth to what the Europeans were saying, which is like, we bring civilization, right? Even if both of those things are true, only one of them is what's destined, right? Only one of them is the future, and that is the founding of Rome in this case, or the founding of America in the other example. And so what we're witnessing here, what we're about to see, is a fight now over which kind of attitude the Latins are going to take. Are they going to be like the resentful harpies, saying, this is mine, right? These islands, this food is mine, and you can't take it, you can't have any of it? Or are they going to be like King Latinus, who is the model of the good host king, who is taking in these newcomers and making something great with them? This is set up in the very beginning, and then we'll pick up again when we do this next time. But I want to read one more passage to you, and this is where we learn that Latinus himself also is waiting, holding out for a hero, if you like, that there's something coming up in the future for him too. And this passage, which I'm about to read, begins with the Arva et Urbes, the fields and the cities of the Latin land. And I think purposefully, in the next time we have Longa. So we have Arva Longa, which kind of sounds like Alba Longa, which is going to be one of the settlements that is in the future for the descendants of Aeneas. So I think that there's like a key here that Latinus is going to be a part of this future. He's not left out here. But here's what the narrator says. Those fields and cities had a king, Latinus, now grown old. So there's an ancient history here, right? This is the old king, and you can almost think of him as the king of Rohan, right? Grown old. when Gandalf has to come and liberate him, now grown old, who ruled for a long age of peace. He was a good king. The gods decreed by fate that he should have no son but one who never grew to manhood, lost in youth. So he had a boy, but he was snatched away in youth. An only daughter waited on his house and throne, now ready for a man and grown to marriage age. This is an incredibly charged and potent and built up moment, right? This is like the woman, the woman Lavinia that we're talking about here. The princess is ripe to bursting, right? She's ready for a man and grown to marriage age. And many came from far and wide in Latium. The time is coming, right? This is like the stars are aligning. Many came from far and wide in Latium and in Ausonia to seek her hand. The first and best and handsomest was Turnus, son of ancient blood, and he was who Latinus' queenly wife loved best, and wanted eagerly to join her family. This is Amata, very important character, and kind of the representative of all that. Turnus and Amata together are the representative of the resentment of not wanting the new thing to come. Amata really wants Turnus to marry Lavinia, but heaven's portents with their terrors blocked the way, and there's a bunch of different monstra kind of signs and portents and bad omens that tell Latinus he cannot marry his daughter to a local. He has to wait for a foreigner to arrive. And when Aeneas comes, he's instantly going to recognize this is the guy. Behold the man, right? We've been waiting for this guy this whole time. And now finally he's here and I'm going to marry him off to my daughter. And that is going to cause all kind of problems, all sorts of issues because of the legitimate grievance that somebody like Turnus might have, that it looks obvious that the next thing to happen, if we're going to do things the way we typically do things, right? And that's what Amata is saying, like, this is obvious, right? It's an obvious match. He's handsome. He's great. He's from good blood. He's got an excellent pedigree. Why wouldn't we marry Lavinia, our daughter, the princess, off to this great lord? And why wouldn't they reign the way we always have reigned, right? And I think one possible answer to that question might be that underneath the surface, if you look closer, this prophecy is about the fact that the line of Latinus is coming to its natural end. I think that is the point of the gods denying him a son and cutting off his son in youth, that the manhood of this civilization is somehow spent. And again, we're not given a lot of detail, but we are given a kind of picture, illusion, suggestion that this is true. And even the words that Virgil uses when he says that he did not have proles virilis. It's not just a male issue, it's a virile offspring, right? He didn't have like the manly sort of just chutzpah like left in him somehow. He's grown old, right? This is a natural end to his line. And I think that part of Latinus' virtue is that he's ready to kind of celebrate that he's ready to like let that in and accept that at least, and bring in this new infusion of young blood, which is what the Romans very much were in their early history. I think in the background of this episode, there is absolutely the story of the rape of the Sabine women, which is when the Romans were all just a bunch of like outlaw brigands and bandits and rough men. And so they didn't know how to ally themselves with the daughters of any of the surrounding areas. Again, like the kind of local populations all looked down on them and they said, get lost. We don't want to marry you to our daughters. And so instead they had to stage this very devious and kind of questionable enterprise where they ambushed the Sabine women and they just carried them off and basically made them their wives. And then there was a war, but the Sabine women had to step in themselves because now they were the daughters of the Sabines, but also the brides of the Romans, right? And there is this fusion that brings an end to war. And that's what the woman, kind of the women's role in this sort of allegory is. And I think Lavinia is kind of going to play that role too, that these are these young men, right, that have been traveling, that probably look like a mess, right? I mean, I assume they would have been like dirty and bedraggled and kind of rough, and you can imagine them stomping with their dirty boots into the halls of King Latinus and saying like, well, we're here to marry your daughter. And Latinus, by all natural rights, should say, like, I'm going to go with Turnus. But in fact, he's keyed in, right? Clued in, and he knows that something is ending and something new is beginning, and he's going to be a part of it. Amata, not so much. Turnus, not so much. And so next time, that's where we're going to pick up the story, is with the resistance, the hashtag resistance to the arrival of the Romans among the indigenous Latinx peoples. Okay, this was a particularly fun episode. I don't know, do you guys feel that way? I would love to know if you liked this episode, because I really loved doing this episode in particular. We're not far-ish from the end here, so please start thinking, if you would, about stuff you would like to do next. Do you want to do the Divine Comedy next? Do you want to do Beowulf next? What's a good thing? I mean, we want to do something that's not epic altogether on the show. I've really loved doing these longer series and having time to explore texts in detail, and I would love to hear from you about where we could go next after we finish the Aeneid. So start thinking about that. Let that percolate. I used to have a teacher, an English teacher in high school, who would say, I'm going to deposit that egg in your subconscious and let it incubate, which is an extremely Freudian. I think she was a Jungian, but it was a very Freudian thing of her to say. Anyway, I'm going to deposit that egg in all of your subconscious and let it incubate. What would you like to do next? But first, we got to do It Figures. This is where we talk about rhetorical tropes and figures of speech. You've probably already seen that Virgil's a master craftsman of words. There's a lot of hidden allusions here and double meanings. Nunc repeto is just an amazing little aside that we talked about. Now I'm retelling, or I'm revising this story in retrospect, in hindsight. Virgil is doing things with language that people have been doing for centuries before him. He's also innovating, but there are things that we have names for that are part of the record, and it's really useful to know the names, because you can use them and understand them and see when people are using them on you, even if they don't know that that's what they're doing. You can spot rhetorical tricks when people are pulling them, and you won't misuse words. Last time we talked about irony, which is one of those words that's used so much that it basically means nothing anymore. Now you will know what it means. It means this kind of misdirection or double meaning, this smoke screen where you say one thing, but there's something else behind it, or something is happening, but there's like a visible other thing going on. Now I want to talk to you about paradox, which is kind of a related concept. Paradoxa in Greek means like two opinions or two attitudes, two perceptions that are alongside or possibly even at odds with each other. And typically when we say a paradox, it's not wrong to say that a paradox is something that contradicts itself, but it's a very special kind of contradiction. And this is why you have to watch out when you use this word, because a paradox is not just any contradiction. It's a contradiction that somehow exists in reality, that holds two seemingly contradictory things together at once and makes them a secret third thing, right? These two seemingly contradictory things kind of blend, and they layer over para next to alongside each other. And then you can see like this double vision, like when you have 3D glasses and there's a red lens and a blue lens. Now I'm dating myself because this isn't how 3D glasses work anymore, but there used to be a red lens and a blue lens, and the two lenses would kind of meld into one in your vision. That's a paradox. And so it's not just any contradiction, it's the kind of contradiction that we had when I read the first passage today about the fulfillment of the prophecy, that there was the beginning of an end to all of the pain of the Trojans, right? That this was the first thing, right? This arrival where they come to Latium and they eat their tables and all of that stuff. That's the beginning, but it's also the beginning of the end, because it's the closing of the first 6 books and the opening of this new set of 6 books, books 7 through 12. That is a paradox. And in fact, the many contradictions that we have explored throughout this episode are all kind of paradoxical, right? How is it the case that this prophecy is both a curse from Kalino and a blessing from Anchises? Well, we talked about all sorts of ways in which that might be true, right? How is it the case that the Trojans are both invaders and liberators? Well, you can see it from both perspectives, and if you fuse them together, you might be able to make it a third, fuller, rounder picture, which is what poetry is really good at doing. Finally, how is it the case that the Trojans and the Latins can hashtag coexist? Well, maybe they're two communities, cultures, civilizations can fuse and blend, and the prophecies on one side can align with the prophecies on the other. You get that eclipse effect, and a new third thing can be born, namely Rome. So that's paradox, right? It's two seemingly contradictory things lined up against each other to produce something entirely new altogether that somehow holds these two contradictions at place at once. A very important way to be able to think in our highly polarized age, if you ask me. A lot of times when people say things, and maybe I will be in hot water with some of my Catholic or Protestant listeners when I say this, but for instance, when people argue, like, is the Eucharist real or is it a metaphor? It's like, brother, it is both of those things. Like when Dumbledore says at the end to Harry is in the end of Harry Potter, Harry is having this afterlife experience, this near-death experience, and he says, "Is this all in my head?" And Dumbledore says, "Of course it's all in your head, Harry. Why should that mean it's any less real?" There are many, many debates that are actually kind of like this, where you can say yes and get to a truer version of things than if you just left paradox out of your view altogether. If you just cut paradox out. So that's it figures, and the correct use of the word paradox, which is slightly different from what you might hear in other contexts. Okay. I also have a mailbag question, and mailbag questions come to me via Substack. Been getting some great ones lately. I've got a queue. I'm going to get through them, but please keep them coming at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. You can become a subscriber and get my regular notes and messages and all sorts of things. That's where I put, I think, my best written work, unless I publish it in another third-party venue. A lot of the stuff that I am most caring about right now is on Substack. You can also subscribe to become a paid subscriber and support me. I would really appreciate that. Helps me keep the lights on and keep this podcast kind of mission-driven rather than choked full of ads. I do take ads, but only the ones I really believe in. And part of that is because you guys very generously support me by paying for subscriptions. So please do that. But even if you're not a paid subscriber, you can be in the mailbag. And that is also how you can tell me about things you would like to read together next on Young Heretics, is through the DM function on Substack. But today I've got a mailbag question from Dan. And Dan says he's been reading our boy, C.S. Lewis. Heck yeah. Love anytime somebody's reading C.S. Lewis, I feel like that's a win. And he's reading Learning in Wartime, which is a speech that Lewis gave. One of his best. I think it's from a collection. I believe it's in a collection that I think might be his best book ever, and that's The Weight of Glory. In Learning in Wartime, says Dan, Lewis makes the point that any human vocation can be spiritual so long as it's offered up to God as if done to the Lord. Tight, says Dan. Yeah, whether you eat or drink, right? Do this in the glory of God. He then talks about how we discern what our own personal calling might be. And he says this: if our parents have sent us to Oxford, if our country allows us to remain there, this is prima facie evidence that the life which we, at any rate, can best lead to the glory of God at present is the learned life. My question: is this true in 2025, in an era of elite overproduction, ideological mission creep, and perverse economic incentives? Are institutions like Harvard, Duke, and dare I add Oxford and Yale still prima facie evidence of a call to a learned or theological life? How else might we discern this call if the university is no longer what it was for Lewis? Okay, great question. Here's how I'm going to answer it. I think that what Lewis is saying generally in the big picture is still entirely true. It's eternally true. But that the specifics of how that works out might not be the same as they were for Lewis. But what I mean by that is, Lewis is talking to people, he says this here, he's talking to people whose parents have sent them to Oxford, whose country allows them to remain there. It's wartime, right? So he's saying you have not been called up to serve in the army, and so you don't need to worry that you're actually supposed to be in the army because this is the thing that you are doing now. Broadly, big picture there, I think what he's saying is there is a lot that you can learn about your vocation from the things that you can't change. These kids probably can't change, or they are sort of locked into this path that their parents have set out for them. And they, in their society, wouldn't want to reject that parental gift. And I still think, even now, that there is something really valuable in seeing things through to their conclusion, seeing them all the way through to the end, even if you might say, gosh, Oxford's really not what it was in Lewis's day, right? If your parents really like want to send you to Oxford and you actually are on board and you go and then you discover there that actually it's terrible and you hate it, seeing it through to the end, it feels like a long time, but it won't in retrospect, right? Forsan et haec olim meminisse iuvabit, right? One day you will look back and you'll be glad that you saw these things through. And the things that you can't change are part of your vocation. That's what Lewis, I think, means by prima facie evidence. That is, on the face of it, God's will includes this for you. Now, we don't necessarily live in the same kind of society where your parents like pick your college and they send you there and you're sort of obligated to follow through. That might be your situation, but you might also have a much bigger range of choice and you might be able to transfer or you might be able to choose your college in advance, right? And on top of that, the colleges that are best and ideal are not the colleges that were ideal or best in Lewis's day, right? Many colleges have fallen or deteriorated in quality. And so I don't think what Lewis is saying here is like, Oxford is definitely the best place for you to go, or like the thing that is happening to like the things that are best in my day, the schools that are best in my day are still like destined for you to go to now. Instead, I think he's saying something more like, seek the good of the city in which you find yourself, which is a line, I think, from Jeremiah, right? And it's about living in exile, right? When you're a Jew in Babylon and these people look like heathens and pagans to you, but you should throw yourself into your situation as it is because God has a vocation for you there too. I don't think that what he's saying applies necessarily to situations where you can choose a college, right? He's not saying if you can choose a college, choose Oxford. He's saying choose what you think will magnify God's glory best, but also understand that things where you don't have a choice, that you just have to accept, that's a message too from God, that this is a place where you can act to his glory, where you can do good, love justice, and show mercy, right? That is a thing that you can do whatever your situation happens to be. And the fact that that is your situation is evidence of that because it's clearly part of God's plan, because it's happening now. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't take steps to change that situation when the opportunity arises. Just means if you don't have the opportunity, you should know and trust that you can eat and drink to the glory of God, even here, even wherever you are, even if you're on the island of the Harpies, even if you are currently in a situation you don't really like, if you are just waiting for the moment that you can quit your job and get a new one, like that's awesome. And you should, if you can, the minute you can do that responsibly and support your family and all of that, you should make that change. But until that point, when you can't make that change, you should accept that part of God's will is for you to perhaps learn patience through serving him in this situation. They also serve who only stand and wait, says Milton. So I hope that helps, right? Two different things there. One's the specifics of what Lewis is saying to the crowd he's addressing, but one is the big picture message that he's delivering, which I think is seek the good of the city in which you find yourself. And with that, I can think of no better way to wish you a very, very happy weekend or week whenever you're listening to this. Thank you so much for listening to this show. Thank you for being part of the Young Heretics experience. If you want to do me a solid, just rate this show 5 stars, share it around, let people know about it. That really helps me and helps build the audience ever more, which I'm very grateful for. And I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.